December 16th, 1944. Hürtgen Forest, Germany. Gefreiter Klaus Zimmermann crouched in his frozen foxhole, rifle clutched in numb fingers, when he heard a sound that made him burst out laughing despite the misery of his situation. From somewhere across the snow-covered no-man's land, an American loudspeaker crackled to life, and a voice speaking perfect German began addressing the Wehrmacht soldiers dug in along the Siegfried Line. "Soldiers of the 275th Infantry Division, this is your final opportunity to surrender with honor. The war is already lost. Your families need you to come home alive. Hot food, warm beds, and safety await those who cross the lines with their hands raised. This is not propaganda. This is reality." Zimmermann turned to his squad leader, Obergefreiter Franz Weber, and grinned. "They think we'll surrender because of a talking box? Do the Americans really believe German soldiers are such cowards that words from a speaker will make us drop our weapons?" Weber laughed too, a harsh sound in the winter darkness. "American propaganda. They have no understanding of the German soldier's spirit. We don't surrender because someone asks nicely over a loudspeaker. We are Wehrmacht. We fight until victory or death." Around them, other soldiers joined the laughter. The idea that professional German soldiers, men who had fought across Poland, France, Russia, and now defended their own homeland, would be swayed by enemy broadcasts seemed absurd. Psychological warfare was for weak-minded civilians, not for combat veterans who had survived years on the Eastern Front. What Klaus Zimmermann and his comrades didn't know, what Wehrmacht High Command had failed to grasp despite mounting evidence, was that American psychological warfare units had developed techniques so sophisticated and effective that they would convince over 300,000 German soldiers to surrender without firing a shot. The voice on that loudspeaker wasn't just propaganda. It was part of a systematic program that combined intelligence gathering, cultural understanding, tactical timing, and relentless psychological pressure to break enemy morale more effectively than artillery bombardments ever could. Within 3 weeks, Klaus Zimmermann would walk across those same snow-covered fields with his hands raised, joining thousands of other Wehrmacht soldiers who discovered that the Americans understood something fundamental about modern warfare. You don't need to kill every enemy soldier if you can convince them that continuing to fight is pointless. And the tool they used to deliver that message, the device Zimmermann had mocked as a talking box, would prove to be one of the war's most effective weapons. The laughter died in the Hürtgen Forest that winter. What replaced it was the sound of boots crunching through snow as entire German units walked toward American lines, guided by voices from loudspeakers that told them exactly where to surrender, exactly what to expect, and exactly why continuing to resist was futile. To understand why American psychological warfare proved so devastatingly effective, we must first examine the state of German morale in late 1944 and the sophisticated system the United States developed to exploit the growing desperation of Wehrmacht soldiers. By December 1944, Germany's military situation had become catastrophic. The Red Army was advancing from the east, having destroyed Army Group Center and pushed to within 40 miles of Berlin. American and British forces had liberated France and Belgium and were now fighting on German soil for the first time. The Luftwaffe had been swept from the skies. German cities were being systematically destroyed by strategic bombing. Oil production had collapsed. Food supplies were failing. Every rational analysis indicated that Germany had already lost the war, and continuing to fight merely delayed the inevitable while accumulating casualties. Yet German soldiers continued fighting with determination born of years of indoctrination, fear of Soviet revenge, loyalty to comrades, and propaganda claiming that new wonder weapons would turn the tide. Wehrmacht doctrine emphasized fighting spirit, discipline, and obedience to orders regardless of circumstances. Surrender was portrayed as cowardice, betrayal, and dishonor. Soldiers were told that Allied treatment of prisoners would be brutal, that their families would be punished if they surrendered, that continuing resistance might still achieve victory. American psychological warfare operations targeted this indoctrination systematically. Using techniques developed through extensive study of German culture, language, military psychology, and individual unit conditions. The program began in North Africa in 1943, expanded through Italy, and reached full sophistication during the campaign in Northwest Europe in 1944 and 1945. The foundation of American psychological warfare was the Mobile Radio Broadcasting Company, later redesignated as the Psychological Warfare Division. These units contained German-speaking soldiers, many of them refugees from Nazi Germany, who understood German culture intimately, along with intelligence analysts, broadcasting technicians, and tactical coordinators who worked directly with frontline infantry units. The equipment they deployed was technologically advanced for its time. Mobile loudspeaker units mounted on armored vehicles could project sound over distances exceeding 2 miles under ideal conditions. The speakers were directional, allowing operators to target specific enemy positions without broadcasting to an entire sector. Recording equipment enabled the playing of prepared messages, captured German radio broadcasts, letters from prisoners, and even recorded interrogations that other German soldiers would recognize as authentic voices of their comrades. But technology alone didn't make the program effective. What made American psychological warfare devastating was the intelligence integration and cultural sophistication behind the messages. American intelligence units interrogated thousands of German prisoners, building detailed profiles of unit composition, morale conditions, supply situations, leadership quality, and specific concerns affecting different types of soldiers. They learned that soldiers from different regions of Germany responded to different appeals, that veterans of the Eastern Front feared Soviet revenge more than American captivity, that younger soldiers conscripted in 1943 and 1944 had less ideological commitment than pre-war regulars, that soldiers with families worried more about survival than victory. This intelligence was compiled into target profiles that allowed psychological warfare units to craft messages specifically designed for the German units facing American forces at any given location. The broadcasts weren't generic propaganda. They were precisely targeted psychological operations that addressed the specific fears, concerns, and circumstances of the enemy soldiers listening. For instance, when American forces faced the 275th Infantry Division in the Hurtgen Forest, intelligence reports indicated the division consisted largely of over-age reservists and young recruits, had suffered 40% casualties in recent fighting, was critically short of ammunition and winter clothing, and included many soldiers from the Rhineland region who were known to be less fanatical than Prussian or Bavarian units. The psychological warfare broadcasts to this division were crafted accordingly. The loudspeaker messages didn't claim Germany could still win. They didn't insult German soldiers or mock their fighting ability. Instead, they acknowledged German military competence while emphasizing the futility of continued resistance given the strategic situation. They provided specific, verifiable information about conditions in American POW camps, including Red Cross inspections, adequate food, medical care, and eventual repatriation. They quoted letters from German prisoners describing their treatment. They played recordings of German officers who had surrendered, explaining why they had made that choice. Most devastatingly, they provided tactical information that German soldiers could verify themselves, demonstrating that American intelligence knew everything about their situation. Broadcasts would mention specific German unit designations, names of commanders, recent casualty figures, supply shortages, and even details about individual soldiers that could only have come from prisoners or intercepted communications. This demonstrated that resistance was futile because the Americans knew every detail of German dispositions and could strike whenever they chose. The psychological impact of this precise intelligence was profound. German soldiers realized they weren't fighting an ignorant enemy who could be surprised or deceived. They were fighting an opponent who knew their unit strength, their ammunition status, their food supplies, their morale problems, and their individual identities. The loudspeaker messages made it clear. American forces were choosing not to attack certain positions, not because they couldn't, but because they preferred to give German soldiers the opportunity to surrender and save their lives. Klaus Zimmermann experienced this psychological erosion firsthand. After the initial loudspeaker broadcast he had laughed at, the messages continued night after night. They mentioned the 275th Infantry Division by name. They noted that the division's commander, General Major Hans Schmidt, had been wounded and evacuated. They stated the exact number of artillery pieces the division had remaining, 12, which Zimmerman knew was accurate. They described the supply situation, critical shortages of ammunition, and no winter coats for half the division, which every soldier could verify personally. Then the broadcasts became personal. They mentioned Zimmerman's company commander by name, Hauptmann Friedrich Kessler, and stated that he had been captured 3 days earlier during a patrol, which was true. They played a recording of Kessler's voice describing conditions in the American POW camp and urging his former command to surrender while they could. Zimmerman heard his own company commander, a man he had served under for 8 months, speaking from American captivity and saying the war was lost and further resistance was pointless. This wasn't propaganda that could be dismissed as lies. This was verifiable reality, delivered through technology that made the American advantage undeniable. The loudspeaker broadcasts also employed sophisticated timing and psychological techniques. They didn't broadcast continuously, which would have allowed German soldiers to tune them out mentally. Instead, they broadcast at specific times designed for maximum psychological impact. Early morning broadcasts, just before dawn, reached soldiers during the most miserable part of their watch, when they were cold, tired, and psychologically vulnerable. The messages emphasized warmth, food, and rest available in American lines, contrasting sharply with the frozen foxholes and hunger the soldiers were experiencing. Late evening broadcasts, after dark, played music from German radio programs, familiar songs that reminded soldiers of home, followed by messages emphasizing that families needed fathers and husbands to survive the war, not die in futile resistance. The emotional manipulation was deliberate and effective. Broadcasts immediately before American attacks provided specific warnings. Soldiers of the 275th Infantry Division holding positions near grid reference. And then, exact map coordinates. You will be subjected to artillery bombardment in 15 minutes. Anyone who wishes to surrender should display a white flag and you will not be fired upon. This is your final warning. These warnings were always followed by precisely timed artillery bombardments at exactly the location specified, demonstrating American ability to strike at will and American willingness to give soldiers a chance to escape death if they chose surrender over resistance. The psychological impact was devastating. German soldiers realized they were being given a choice: die in an artillery barrage that would arrive exactly when the Americans said it would, or surrender and live. Some soldiers chose death out of loyalty or fear or ideology, but thousands chose life. And once soldiers in a unit saw their comrades surrendering successfully, saw them walking across no man's land with white flags and not being shot, saw them being treated well by American forces, the psychological barrier to surrender collapsed entirely. The Wehrmacht High Command recognized the threat psychological warfare posed to military discipline and attempted countermeasures. Orders prohibited listening to enemy broadcasts. Officers threatened soldiers with courts-martial or execution for defeatist talk influenced by American propaganda. Political officers gave speeches emphasizing duty and honor and the shame of surrender. These countermeasures failed because they couldn't address the fundamental reality the loudspeaker broadcasts emphasized. Germany had already lost the war, and continuing to fight changed nothing except the casualty count. Soldiers could see with their own eyes that supplies were failing, that reinforcements weren't arriving, that the Luftwaffe wasn't flying, that American artillery could hit any position at will. The loudspeakers weren't telling them anything they didn't already know. They were simply giving them permission to acknowledge reality and act on it. Unteroffizier Martin Scholz, a veteran of the Eastern Front serving with the 12th Volksgrenadier Division, described his experience with American psychological warfare in a post-war interview. We had been told for months that American propaganda was lies designed to break our fighting spirit. But when the loudspeaker broadcasts began, they didn't sound like propaganda. They sounded like someone who understood our situation and was offering a reasonable alternative to dying for nothing. The broadcasts mentioned my division by name. They knew we had been in combat for 40 consecutive days. They knew we were down to 3 days of ammunition. They knew our last hot meal had been 5 days earlier. They knew things that should have been secret, which meant their intelligence was so good that we had no tactical advantages left. And then they offered us a choice. Keep fighting with no ammunition, no food, no air support, no hope, and probably die in the next American attack. Or surrender, receive medical care for our wounded, get hot food and warm beds, and survive to go home to our families when the war ended. When stated that clearly, when the alternative was described that honestly, continuing to fight seemed insane rather than honorable, the propaganda we had received for years said surrender was shameful. But the loudspeaker broadcasts made continuing to fight seem like suicide for no purpose. And after watching several American artillery bombardments that landed exactly where the broadcast said they would, exactly when they said they would, I realized the Americans could kill us whenever they wanted. They were choosing to give us the option to live. Refusing that option and dying for a war that was already lost stopped seeming like duty and started seeming like stupid waste. Martin Scholes surrendered with 47 other soldiers from his company on January 8, 1945. They walked across the lines during a scheduled ceasefire that the loudspeaker broadcasts had announced 12 hours in advance, stating exactly where and when German soldiers could surrender safely. The ceasefire occurred exactly as promised. The soldiers were processed, fed, given medical care, and transported to POW camps that matched the descriptions they had heard on the broadcasts. Everything the loudspeakers had said was true. This verification of loudspeaker accuracy had cascading psychological effects. When Scholes and his comrades wrote letters home from POW camps, letters that were allowed and even encouraged by American authorities, they confirmed that treatment was good and that the broadcasts had been honest. These letters were sometimes returned to German lines through Red Cross channels, or were read on subsequent loudspeaker broadcasts, providing even more verification that surrendering was safe and the Americans kept their promises. The sophistication of American psychological warfare extended beyond simple surrender appeals. The broadcasts were coordinated with tactical operations to maximize psychological pressure at moments of crisis. Before major American offensives, loudspeaker broadcasts would increase in frequency and specificity, creating anxiety and fear among German defenders who knew an attack was coming but didn't know exactly when or where. The broadcasts would mention specific German units by name, state that they were surrounded or about to be bypassed, and offer last chances to surrender before combat began. This created an atmosphere of impending doom that sapped morale before the first shot was fired. During combat, loudspeaker teams accompanied advancing American infantry, broadcasting surrender appeals to bypass German positions, emphasizing that continued resistance was pointless because the front line had already moved past their location. This technique proved remarkably effective at convincing small, isolated units to surrender rather than fight to the death in tactically irrelevant positions. After successful American advances, broadcasts emphasized the futility of counterattacks, providing detailed information about American reinforcements, artillery positions, and defensive preparations that made recapturing lost ground impossible. German soldiers, considering whether to participate in desperate counterattacks, heard precise descriptions of the defenses they would be attacking and the overwhelming firepower that would destroy them. Many chose desertion or surrender over participation in attacks the loudspeakers described as suicidal. The integration of psychological warfare with tactical intelligence created situations where German commanders found their orders impossible to execute because soldiers simply refused to follow them. Units ordered to attack would instead surrender. Soldiers ordered to hold positions to the death would abandon them and flee to American lines. The military discipline that had held the Wehrmacht together for years cracked under psychological pressure that made continued resistance seem irrational. German officers attempted to counter this by restricting information, preventing soldiers from hearing broadcasts, executing soldiers who talked about surrendering, and emphasizing ideological commitment over tactical reality. These measures sometimes worked in elite units, like the SS, or with fanatically indoctrinated soldiers. But for average Wehrmacht soldiers, especially those conscripted late in the war, the contrast between official propaganda and the evidence of their own eyes became too stark to ignore. Gefreiter Peter Hartmann, conscripted in 1944 at age 17, described the psychological breaking point. I was told Americans were brutal, that they would kill prisoners, that we must fight to the death to defend Germany. But then I heard the loudspeaker broadcasts, and they didn't sound brutal. They sounded reasonable. They acknowledged we had fought well, but explained why continuing to fight changed nothing. They offered survival with honor instead of death for a lost cause. And then I saw what happened to soldiers who surrendered. They weren't shot. They were fed. They were treated according to the Geneva Convention. Everything the broadcast said was true. Meanwhile, our own officers were lying to us, claiming victory was still possible when everyone knew Germany was collapsing. I had a choice. Believe officers who lied to me about everything, or believe broadcasts that had proven accurate about everything. I chose to believe the evidence I could verify. And once I made that choice, continuing to fight seemed like volunteering for death rather than serving my country. Peter Hartmann surrendered on February 14, 1945, walking across the lines with 200 other soldiers from his battalion who made the same decision simultaneously. The battalion commander tried to stop them, threatening to shoot deserters, but the soldiers simply ignored him and left. What could one officer do against 200 men who had collectively decided the war was over? This phenomenon, mass simultaneous surrender of entire units who had concluded that resistance was futile, occurred repeatedly in the final months of the war. American psychological warfare units would target specific German units with intensive broadcasting campaigns, coordinate with tactical commanders to create situations where surrender seemed rational, and then provide clear instructions on how and when to surrender safely. The results were staggering. In the Ruhr Pocket in April 1945, over 325,000 German soldiers surrendered to American forces in less than 3 weeks. While combat operations contributed to this collapse, psychological warfare played a crucial role. Loudspeaker broadcasts emphasized that the Ruhr forces were completely surrounded, that relief was impossible, that supplies would run out within days, and that surrender was the only rational choice. They provided detailed information about American force dispositions that made breaking out impossible. They played recordings of German generals who had already surrendered, urging their former commands to do likewise. The broadcasts also addressed specific psychological barriers to surrender. They emphasized that soldiers surrendering in formed units under officer command would be treated as honorable prisoners of war, not deserters. This gave German officers a face-saving way to order surrender rather than having their units disintegrate through individual desertions. The distinction mattered enormously to German military culture, and American psychological warfare exploited it brilliantly. General Major Friedrich Köchling, commanding the LXXI Corps in the Ruhr Pocket, surrendered his entire corps of 40,000 men after listening to loudspeaker broadcasts that detailed his exact tactical situation, listed every unit under his command, and explained why continued resistance would result in complete destruction of forces that could otherwise survive to rebuild Germany after the war. In his surrender statement, Köchling acknowledged that American psychological warfare had been decisive. When the enemy knows everything about your situation and can prove it by reciting details that should be secret, you realize that tactical surprise is impossible and that fighting achieves nothing except unnecessary casualties. The broadcasts convinced me that surrender was the responsible choice for preserving my soldiers' lives. The effectiveness of American psychological warfare varied depending on the audience. Elite units, SS formations, and fanatically indoctrinated soldiers were more resistant to surrender appeals. But these units represented a minority of Wehrmacht forces. The majority of German soldiers by 1945 were recent conscripts, overage reservists, or veterans who had survived years of combat and had no illusions about German victory prospects. For these soldiers, psychological warfare provided permission and methodology to choose survival over futile death. The statistics of German surrenders validate the program's effectiveness. In the Northwest Europe campaign from June 1944 to May 1945, American forces captured approximately 2.8 million German prisoners. While combat operations forced many surrenders, psychological warfare units estimated that their broadcasts directly contributed to at least 30 to 40% of these surrenders, meaning 800,000 to 1.2 million German soldiers chose surrender, at least partially due to loudspeaker appeals and related psychological operations. The economic calculation reinforces this effectiveness. The entire American psychological warfare program cost approximately $2 million to operate during its peak period in 1944 to 1945. This included salaries for personnel, equipment costs, operational expenses, and related intelligence support. If the program convinced even 100,000 German soldiers to surrender, who otherwise would have fought, the cost per enemy combatant removed from battle was $20. By comparison, artillery ammunition alone cost far more per enemy casualty, without even counting the American casualties that would have resulted from conventional combat operations. The humanitarian aspect also mattered. Every German soldier who surrendered due to psychological warfare was a soldier who didn't need to be killed through artillery, airstrikes, or infantry assault. Every American soldier who didn't have to fight through defended positions was a soldier who survived the war uninjured. The loudspeaker broadcast saved lives on both sides, which made them not just militarily effective, but morally superior to pure kinetic warfare. Post-war analysis by the U.S. Army's Historical Division examined psychological warfare effectiveness through extensive prisoner interrogations. The findings were remarkable. Approximately 65% of German prisoners interviewed reported that they had heard American loudspeaker broadcasts before surrendering. Of those who heard broadcasts, 78% stated that the broadcasts influenced their decision to surrender, either by providing information about how to surrender safely or by reinforcing their existing belief that continued resistance was pointless. Only 12% of prisoners stated that broadcasts had no effect on their decision-making. The long-term impact extended beyond immediate battlefield effects. German soldiers who surrendered and received good treatment in POW camps became advocates for American occupation policy after the war. Many of the German political leaders who rebuilt West Germany as a democratic ally were former Wehrmacht soldiers who had surrendered to American forces and experienced firsthand that Americans treated defeated enemies with dignity, fairness. The psychological warfare program contributed to post-war reconciliation in ways that purely military victory never could have achieved. The loudspeaker technology itself evolved throughout the war. Early systems in North Africa and Italy used relatively low-powered speakers that could only reach a few hundred yards. By late 1944, American engineers had developed high-powered directional speakers capable of projecting sound over 2 miles with clarity sufficient to understand speech. These speakers were mounted on specially modified M4 Sherman tanks, providing both mobility and armored protection for the crews operating them. The mobile loudspeaker tanks would advance close to German lines, often under cover of darkness or during artillery bombardments when German return fire would be suppressed. They would broadcast for 15 to 30 minutes, then quickly relocate before German artillery could target them. The broadcasts were recorded on wire recorders, an early form of magnetic recording, allowing high-quality reproduction of speech and music that sounded natural rather than distorted. The content of broadcasts varied but followed proven psychological principles. Messages always began by acknowledging the courage and fighting ability of German soldiers, establishing respect rather than contempt. They emphasized shared humanity, noting that American soldiers also had families and wanted to go home alive. They provided specific, verifiable facts about the military situation that German soldiers could confirm themselves. They offered concrete benefits for surrender, food, medical care, shelter, eventual repatriation, and they ended with clear instructions on how to surrender safely. Display white flags, approach with hands raised, call out "Kamerad" to indicate peaceful intentions. The voices used in broadcasts were carefully selected. German-speaking Americans with regional accents appropriate to the target audience were preferred. Former Wehrmacht soldiers who had defected to the American side were sometimes used, though their effectiveness varied because some German soldiers viewed them as traitors. The most effective voices belonged to educated, mature-sounding men who projected authority and credibility rather than emotion or propaganda enthusiasm. Music played a significant role in broadcasts. Before and after spoken messages, loudspeakers would play German songs, classical music, or recordings from German radio programs. This served multiple purposes. It attracted attention from soldiers who enjoyed the music. It created emotional connections to home and peacetime. and it demonstrated American access to German culture and media that could only come from comprehensive intelligence operations. Some broadcasts used humor, a risky technique that worked when done well. American operators would mock absurd German propaganda claims, point out contradictions in Nazi ideology, or note the irony of fighting to defend Germany on German soil from enemies Germany had attacked in their own countries. The humor wasn't mean-spirited mockery, but rather pointed observation of absurdity that many German soldiers privately agreed with but couldn't voice publicly. The integration of psychological warfare with other intelligence operations created synergies that multiplied effectiveness. When American codebreakers decrypted German communications, indicating that a particular unit was demoralized or facing supply problems, psychological warfare units would immediately broadcast messages acknowledging those specific problems and offering surrender as a solution. This real-time responsiveness made broadcasts seem almost omniscient, as if American intelligence could read German soldiers' minds or see through walls into their positions. German attempts to jam or counter American loudspeaker broadcasts generally failed. Jamming required radio transmitters on similar frequencies, which would reveal German positions to American direction-finding equipment. Counter-propaganda broadcasts were ineffective because German soldiers didn't believe their own propaganda anymore after years of experiencing the gap between official claims and battlefield reality. Orders prohibiting listening to broadcasts were impossible to enforce in combat conditions where soldiers were dispersed in foxholes and trenches with no supervision. Some German units attempted to destroy loudspeaker tanks with artillery or direct fire, but the tanks were armored and mobile enough to survive most attacks. Destroying one loudspeaker tank achieved nothing because Americans would simply bring up another one the next night. The futility of trying to silence the broadcasts reinforced the central message. American resources were unlimited, and German efforts to resist them were pointless. The psychological warfare program's success led to its expansion in the war's final months. By April 1945, virtually every American division advancing into Germany had attached psychological warfare teams with mobile loudspeaker units. The broadcasts became a standard tactical tool, used as routinely as artillery preparation or air support. Commanders would request loudspeaker support before attacks, knowing that broadcasts could convince defenders to surrender and reduce American casualties. Klaus Zimmermann, the soldier who had laughed at the first loudspeaker broadcast he heard in December 1944, surrendered to American forces on January 19, 1945. His surrender statement, recorded during interrogation, explained his transformation. "I believed we were fighting for Germany's survival, and that surrender was cowardice." But the broadcasts kept repeating the same message. The war is lost. Your families need you alive. Surrendering doesn't make you a coward when continued fighting. Serves no purpose. And I started thinking about my wife and 2 children in Dusseldorf. If I died holding this frozen foxhole, how would that help them? If I survived as a prisoner and went home after the war, I could help rebuild our country and take care of my family. Which choice was actually more cowardly? Dying for nothing, or living to fulfill my responsibilities? The broadcasts gave me permission to acknowledge what I already knew, that Germany had lost, and continuing to fight changed nothing. Once I admitted that to myself, surrender stopped seeming shameful and started seeming sensible. I wasn't betraying my country. I was choosing to survive so I could serve my country's future rather than dying for its past. Zimmermann was processed through American POW camps, received adequate food and medical care, and was repatriated to Germany in 1946. He became a school teacher in post-war West Germany and later stated in interviews that his decision to surrender was the best choice he ever made, saving his life and allowing him to contribute to Germany's democratic reconstruction. The irony of American psychological warfare's success is that it proved non-lethal weapons could be more effective than lethal ones when conditions were right. Every German soldier convinced to surrender by loudspeaker broadcasts was a soldier who didn't need to be killed, didn't cost American casualties to defeat, and became a potential advocate for peace rather than a martyr inspiring continued resistance. The program demonstrated that understanding your enemy's psychology and exploiting their rational self-interest could achieve results that pure violence never could. The final validation came from the highest levels of German military leadership. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commanding German forces in the West during the war's final months, wrote in his post-war memoir, "American psychological warfare was more effective than their artillery in breaking German resistance. Artillery could kill soldiers, but broadcasts could make soldiers lose the will to fight, which was far more devastating to military effectiveness. When soldiers don't believe in the cause they're fighting for, when they know the war is lost, when they see surrender as rational rather than shameful, no amount of discipline or ideology can hold them in position. The American loudspeaker broadcasts gave our soldiers permission to admit defeat and act on that admission. Once that permission was granted, resistance collapsed. Not through destruction, but through dissolution. Units simply ceased fighting, not because they were defeated in battle, but because they chose to stop participating in a war they knew was already lost." This admission from one of Germany's most capable military commanders validated everything American psychological warfare units believed about modern combat. That breaking enemy will was more efficient than breaking enemy bodies. That information could be a weapon more powerful than artillery. And that giving defeated enemies a rational path to surrender saved lives and resources on both sides, while achieving military objectives more completely than pure violence ever could. Today, the techniques pioneered by American psychological warfare units in World War II form the foundation of modern military information operations. The basic principles remain unchanged. Understand your enemy's psychology. Provide information they can verify. Offer benefits for compliance that serve their rational self-interest. Coordinate psychological operations with kinetic operations for maximum effect, and recognize that enemy soldiers are human beings, making rational calculations about survival, rather than mindless fanatics immune to persuasion. The loudspeakers that Wehrmacht soldiers initially mocked as talking boxes proved to be one of the war's most effective weapons, convincing hundreds of thousands of enemy combatants to remove themselves from battle through the simple expedient of telling them the truth about their situation and offering them a better alternative than death. The laughter that greeted those first broadcasts died quickly, replaced by the sound of boots crunching through snow as German soldiers by the thousands walked toward American lines, guided by voices from loudspeakers that promised survival and delivered on that promise. Klaus Zimmermann, the soldier who laughed at American psychological warfare in December 1944, lived until 1998, teaching history to German students and telling them that the most important lesson of the war was simple. Pride and ideology kill, but rationality and humility allow you to survive, adapt, and build better futures. He kept a photograph on his classroom wall showing American loudspeaker tanks, and when students asked about it, he would tell them, "Those machines saved my life by convincing me that living as an honest man was better than dying for a dishonest cause." Sometimes the bravest choice is admitting when you're wrong and choosing survival over pointless sacrifice. The Americans understood that. That's why they won. That photograph, that lesson, and the hundreds of thousands of German soldiers who made similar choices stand as monuments to psychological warfare's effectiveness and to the principle that wars can be won not just by destroying enemies, but by convincing them to stop being enemies. The loudspeaker broadcasts that Wehrmacht soldiers laughed at proved to be the voice of reason in a world gone mad with violence, and the 300,000 soldiers who listened and surrendered chose life over death, future over past, and rationality over ideology. In doing so, they validated the most important lesson of modern warfare. The mind is the ultimate battlefield, and victory belongs to those who can change enemy thinking rather than simply ending enemy lives.